as well, talking about domestic violence and an interesting billboard that went up in Toronto. It says the new billboard trying to generate a different type of conversation when it comes to domestic violence. It shows a woman about to hit a man, and it says, quote, half of domestic violence victims are men. No domestic violence shelters are dedicated to us, it says. And of course, we put up on Facebook and Twitter, feel free to join the conversation. If you know of somebody or you are a victim, a male victim of domestic violence. I told you a scenario of a friend of mine who had this happen to him. I'm also going to read a note to you now that someone sent to me anonymously, so I'll respect that. It says, I am a survivor of domestic abuse. This written from a man. Mostly the abuse was a mental thing. Occasionally it became physical. In the end, I lost my job and she decided to leave. Unfortunately, she took the kids and denied me access to them. Eventually, I regained access to my daughters and have been working to repair that relationship ever since. You have, I'm trying to edit this as I go because it gets personal. If I had, this person has since now remarried. If I had met her first, I probably would still be married and our kids would never have experienced the broken home, which they have endured. I agree that more men need to come forward about the abuse they have endured in the hope that the vicious cycle can be stopped and those men can get proper help, like counseling. Problem is the perception that, quote, real men don't suffer from spousal abuse. Well, guess what? Real men apparently put up with it so they can avoid the embarrassment of having something like this come out publicly. Thank you for discussing this topic on your show. To talk more about all of this now is Gary Dierenfeld, social worker, yoursocialworker.com to find out more. He's with us now. Good afternoon, Gary. How are you today?
I'm good, Scott, and happy to be with you talking about this very sensitive issue.
You know, it's odd because I must admit I knew this was happening because, again, as I mentioned before earlier on, that I've got a friend that went through this and actually got divorced because of this.
Yep.
Many, many years ago. But this billboard that says half of, now it's not quite half, but it's certainly very close. That's a staggering number. Do you think most people realize that this goes on that much?
Well, that's if you accept that at face value, which I don't, quite frankly. The way that that's presented is misleading. Now, having said that, you know, it can be misleading. It doesn't mean that men aren't at times the victims of domestic violence. Having said that, women are disproportionately at greater risk of harm than are men, which is not to say, hey, some men really don't get hurt in domestic violence. Also, when we analyze people hitting or hurting other people, we differentiate between different kinds of domestic violence, or the attitudes or the motivations or the intentions or the situation behind that. And so in defining domestic violence, you know, we have a number of different categories. The most troubling typically is what we call coercive controlling domestic violence, and that is where one uses violence in all its different forms to lure power and control over another person. Typically, in the context of men and women, men are far more apt to use physical forms of violence to lure power and control. Women may be seen to use more manipulative forms. Women will be at greater risk of physical harm up to and including death than will be men. So we have to have a much more informed discussion when we're talking about domestic violence. Also, the website was put up by an association that shows itself as the Canadian Association for Equality, yet when you look into the mandate of that organization from their website, really they're looking to offer services and advocacy for men and boys with the view that they are being discriminated against. So on the one hand it says equality, yet on the other hand, really, it's a website dedicated to the interests of men and boys.
That was something that sent up a red flag for me initially when I saw this as well, Gary, because the initial statement was that they weren't as concerned about violence towards men, domestic violence towards men, as they were charging that the government was being sexist in its campaign for female domestic abuse.
Right.
So you're thinking, well, if you're going to draw attention to this issue that needs attention drawn to it, that's great. But once you start pulling in, well, not only is this not right, but that campaign is sexist, then obviously it gets, the message gets a little muddled.
Yeah. So there's a little. It's not quite as clear, the issue and the group advocating or speaking to this. I think they have an agenda of their own that's not consistent with how they present themselves superficially.
That's a drag, because that would probably give this less credibility than what it deserves.
There you go.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
And here is the issue: some men are being hurt. It's not near the same kinds of numbers as women. So you don't want to deliver your message in a way that undermines the messenger. And I think that Billboard can do that.
On the other hand, because it's not severe, does that mean that it's right, or does needs any less attention? I mean, obviously, if a man's going to beat on a woman, it's going to be a lot more severe because he's bigger and stronger than if a woman beats on a man. So you can see how, there's more abuse or more physical abuse, more danger to women than there is to men. But just because the beatings aren't as severe because of one's size, does that make it any different?
So, when we look at how we allocate funding for any kind of service, we say, what are the numbers? Who needs this the most? And so when we give in one area, we do that, and we may do that disproportionately because it's supported by the numbers that we're looking at. And so, I can hear men saying, hey, there's no services for men, and for the most part, that's quite true. There aren't shelters dedicated to men. But having said that, the need is so disproportionately greater for women that is where the bulk of the money goes. And it's not inappropriate to do that, but it's a shame that where necessary there aren't some services for men too. But let's keep all of this in proportion. It doesn't have to. We don't have to present one group totally at the expense of the other.
You bring up a very valid point, and one of the main reasons for that is because each one needs a different solution.
Well,
I mean, maybe men don't need shelters as much as women, but that doesn't mean that the problem doesn't need to be addressed.
Right. And so it does need to be addressed, and I've certainly worked with men who have been the victim of woman-perpetrated violence. One of the great issues that they're dealing with, not different from women, they deal with it as well, but that sense of shame and embarrassment. Being a man, you're not supposed to be hurt by a woman. We're supposed to be bigger than that, so to speak. So it does create a barrier for men coming forward, but the truth of the matter is there are substantial systemic barriers for women coming forward as well. They're not believed. The cases aren't prosecuted. They're worried about recrimination. From an economic perspective, women are at greater risk of economic harm and doing more poorly as a result of domestic violence than men. So this isn't a gender-neutral issue by any means.
I can remember the situation with the buddy of mine. He was just a nice, mild-mannered guy. And I don't think I ever remember him being in a fight as a kid. He just wasn't that type of guy. And she would just start arguing with him and then just start hitting him. And he knew as soon as he hit her that he was done.
Yep.
It was as if she was almost trying to trap him into doing that.
Oh, yeah.
And whenever he called anybody or the police on it, it was him that was asked to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. So we certainly do need to appreciate that there are these experiences out there. It's not that this stuff doesn't happen. It does. And the challenge, unfortunately, for our first responders is separating fact from fiction. And we can only ever, any of us, you, me, the first responders, any of the groups, we can only do as good as we can do in the moment. And sometimes it comes across as equivocal. We don't know who necessarily started or stopped or threw the first volley. And so at the end of the day, we just sometimes need to make decisions to say, this is dangerous, co-residing. We have to separate these persons for their own safety. And so a safety decision is made, not necessarily the best in terms of who has to go, but typically it is better to separate persons who are at risk of hurting each other.
So what is it about these numbers? They say, in backing up the claim, they say 2009 Stats Canada survey found an estimated 601,000 Canadian women and 585,000 men experience spousal violence.
So again, we need to differentiate the kind of spousal violence.
Right.
It's really common that in the throes of a marital separation or, a separation with your significant other, that things escalate out of hand. Somebody may throw something, somebody may slap somebody's face, and those things all get counted in those statistics. But at the end of the day, if somebody says, "How dare you sleep with the other person," and slaps, that the person who slept around in the face, that gets counted as domestic violence. But really, that's not what we're worried about.
Right.
Okay? No one's going to live or die on that.
Yeah.
I may have a bit of a red face, but what we're really concerned about is the coercive, controlling violence. Again, where someone demonstrates a pattern of using nefarious strategies to manipulate, control the other person for one's own gains, gratification needs, etc. That's the one we're concerned about. That is where it's disproportionate, men against women, and that is where women are at way greater risk of harm.
Yeah.
When we look at hospital statistics, persons who go to hospitals with broken arms, cuts, bruises, scrapes, our emergency room physicians and nurses over the last 5 to 10 years have started to ask the questions. When somebody says, "Oh, I bumped into a door or fell down the stairs," they say, "Yeah, but who pushed you?"
Yeah.
And so we're learning that of those emergency room visits by women, they're disproportionately they're the result of domestic violence.
And you know what, Gary? I'm not disputing this, but I'm just going off of conversations that I've had with my friend over the years. And, and again, there's no way to measure these stats. But again, if you've take the situation of my friend, who's a nice, mild-mannered guy, he puts up with it for 2 years and decides he's going to get a divorce and he leaves. But what about if all of a sudden on the last day, he snaps and he decides to clock her, and that's a good enough hit that it does physical damage to her? Everybody thinks that, well, no one hurts if she slaps him, no one's going to die, so therefore the problem's ignored until it accelerates and he retaliates. How often does that happen?
Well, those things absolutely do happen, and that's where it becomes the job of the investigators, the prosecutor, defense attorney, assessors, unfortunately, to try and wade in and separate fact from fiction. And let me tell you, in a good many cases, it's quite a challenge. It is quite a challenge.
Well, at the end, we should be respecting everybody, no matter what the gender is. But, when I opened up the phone lines to this a little earlier on, it just seems to me, that we take a greater attention and a more serious attitude towards women talking about this than we do men. And, even using media, whether it's a TV commercial or a radio commercial, I don't know how many times I'm driving in the car and I hear something that says, making a guy look like an idiot. Well, he says that, and it's like if the tables were turned and we were saying that about women, the ad would be yanked.
Sure.
Yet we feel in our mad need to progress women that it's okay to insult guys, as if they completely ignored that guys were insulting them at one time too, and that wasn't right. So what makes it right just because you've turned the tables? Nobody should be insulting anybody.
And, from my perspective, that's why I like the current, I'm going to go here again, the sex ed curriculum, because we're trying to teach children, starting in the younger grades, about self-respect and respect for others, regardless of diversity and differences. And so at the end of the day, no one should be hitting anyone. No one should be seeking to lure power and control over the other. We shouldn't resort to expressions of violence to vent anger. So we want to teach self-control, emotional regulation. We want to teach respect respect. And, at the end of the day, that is more where the Wynne government is coming from than seeking to embroil and ramp up extreme views on any of these issues.
No, one shouldn't diminish the other by any means. And again, as we said, once you start labeling the government's campaign as sexist, I mean, there's lots of things the government does wrong that I don't like, but I don't think I do that, and I'm quite proud of their sex ed curriculum as well. So that does kind of, as we said earlier, take a little bit of the credibility away. That being said, will this open up more discussion on this?
I think it'll create an opportunity for actually violence. There's different kinds of violence, Scott. There is, misinformation as a form of violence. Trying to recalibrate how we see things in a way that distorts reality as a kind of psychological violence. And so I'm kind of bothered that kind of billboard is put up there as a statement of fact, because it doesn't portray at all what is going on, the complexity of the situation, and it is also misleading in terms of the mandate of the organization that's doing it. So I'm worried it will create more disharmony than any harmony whatsoever.
Really?
Yeah.
I may not agree with you on that one, Gary.
Okay. Well, that's my worry when I see a billboard like that.
Yeah.
Really, if we want to get on the same page, I think we have to accept the research where it is and say, you know what? Yeah, women are at a disproportionate greater risk of harm. Having said that, what are we going to do to help men who nonetheless also find themselves in these circumstances? To me, that would be a more appropriate message, saying we can't just help one group and pretend that it doesn't exist whatsoever in another group. Okay, that would be a more appropriate message to open up the dialogue and have us look at violence generally.
Right.
And also men-on-men violence.
Yeah.
Whether it's a gang beating up on another gang or siblings within the same house, so that we look at violence more generically rather than polarizing it as men against women. That only escalates the battle.
Another listener writes, well, we're getting a lot of email on this. One of the problems in this regard when it comes to the government is found in unified family court. The court rarely recognizes this flip side to the issue of domestic abuse. The family court tends to be extremely friendly towards the women that have historically been considered to be the better parent. What male victims of domestic abuse need to be considered and treated equally by the courts and our government as well as everyone. Education is the key to solving the issue. We need to learn how to be better to people and to use proper problem-solving tools in our relationships.
So let me tell you my personal experience. When I work with men who perpetrate violence, who don't want to take responsibility for their violent behavior, they tell me that I'm biased against men. Okay? Mm-hmm. When I work with women who may have been violent, who may have been inappropriate in their relationship towards men, and I seek to give them feedback about that, they tell me I'm biased against women. And so, a person stating that there is this gender-based violence doesn't equal that it's so. It may also be a person who has trouble reflecting on their own behavior and taking responsibility for that. And unfortunately is an issue that is also rampant. And so those who are defensive and seek to ascribe blame to someone else, presenting them themselves as hard done by, there's a lot of folks out there like that, and they will find each other, ramp each other up, support each other, band together as if, somebody else is the common enemy. And quite frankly, I've been the victim of that as well. So saying something is so doesn't make it so. That's why we go back to the research. And whether you like the research or not, it's trying to speak as plainly as possible without trying to affirm beliefs in advance. It just says, let's count things up. Let's see where this occurs. Let's see what happens on the basis of the research. we now define different kinds of violence. And on the basis of the research, we also understand that women are disproportionately more at risk of harm than are men, physically, emotionally, psychologically. But it doesn't mean to say whatsoever that men are ever going through life unscathed in their relationship to women. Men can also be the victim of these things, but it's still disproportionately women.
A new billboard in Toronto is starting to generate a different kind of conversation in regard to domestic violence. Gary Dierenfeld has been with his social worker, yoursocialworker.com, to find out more. Thank you, Gary. As always, have a great day.
You got to know, I'm going to get my own slew of angry emails now, but all I can do is represent the knowledge base, whether we like it or not.
Thank you, Gary.
Take care.
It's 1:27. It's 900 CHML. I'm Scott Thompson.